Ripsy Bandourian, welcome onto the Searching for Mana show.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. Really appreciate it. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you on the show. Ripsy has an incredible background, so really excited to talk through your journey, Ripsy, throughout the show. Currently the Head of Plaid Europe, and we'll open up cutting around what that role encompasses. Just in real brief, Ripsy's background is a tick box of establishments, a Harvard MBA, Goldman's, McKinsey, Apple, and then really moving into, which will make sense when we go through the journey, moving from channels and marketplaces into several years with Booking.com as a very senior VP, and then of course back to Head of Plaid Europe, which is an absolute rocket ship. So can't wait to go through that whole journey. Ripsy, if you could be so kind to open up with, what being the Head of Plaid Europe really entails right now.
For me, with Plaid Europe, it's a number of things. There are relatively clear priorities. One is continuing to establish and grow our presence here. That is about making sure that we deliver the right products to the customers we already have, that we continue to attract new fintechs and apps that are able to use Plaid services today to be able to connect millions of users to fintech services that they provide, and continuing to help and support the team as we grow and scale. That's within Europe. And obviously, with Plaid Europe being kind of a part of a larger organization, I also play a pretty big role in making sure that our strategy continues to be aligned with that of Plaid overall, and making sure that we continue to build what we call internally a transatlantic bridge.
Oh, I love it. A transatlantic bridge. Ripsy, how do you do that? So let's go to how recently you joined Plaid, and really, so the audience could visualize, what has the process been where you have obviously a mandate in Europe, but of course, as you say, the transatlantic bridge there is so that there is a sync with the overall group. What's the process been to get you to that? I'm sure it's been challenging in some parts and very exciting too.
Well, yeah, exactly. It is challenging and exciting at the same time. And actually, I don't think there's too many things that are exciting that aren't challenging. That's as an aside.
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, it's as somebody new coming into Plaid, but also somebody coming in new into the industry, it kind of requires learning on steroids in a lot of ways, because you're trying to understand the existing products in Europe, which by definition, obviously, are different from those that we have in the US, given the regulatory nature of the markets in which we operate. So you understand kind of the products here, you try to understand the customers here. In parallel, you actually need to have a relatively good understanding of the products in the US and the customer needs there, so that you can start thinking strategically and creatively where it makes sense to build a bridge, because it's not a bridge to everywhere, and it's not a bridge that needs to kind of connect every little part of it. It's only in places where it has maximum impact for the customer and for the business. And so kind of continuously being able to focus on that, that's very much where a big challenge has been. And what that entails is honestly lots of digging in and conversations and kind of curiosity of wanting to deeply understand how some things work to be able to then come up to a higher level and start connecting those dots.
Love it. And that's one of the elements that clearly has been, time consuming, and rightly so, since you joined. What have been the other things you've been focusing on? If we were to think about what a week for Ripsy has been like, talk us through one of those.
Yeah, I think there's lots. So there is one, kind of like figuring these things out. Two is, I very much kind of believe that leadership is a craft, and is one that we continue to hone over time. And one of my fundamental beliefs in it is business, but in the end, it's humans that make business happen. And so it's building those relationships. And for me, it's been very much about building those relationships within the team here in Europe, with our customers here, getting to know what motivates people, what would help them achieve the heights that they didn't even think that they could achieve in the context of Plaid, and how do we set up the right environment for it. So the organizational and the team culture and cohesion and kind of getting all of those pieces right has been a very big portion of my time to date, and continues to be so, to be honest. And then there is a fair amount of time that I also spent with Zach, the founder, with many of the leaders of Plaid, which is, what is the culture of Plaid and what makes Plaid such a special place? That then how do we make sure that we then create that culture here in Europe, but also make it fit in the context of the European markets in which we operate, because you're still operating in a slightly different number, right? So it's kind of like, how far do you push that flavor, and how much are you the same, and continuously playing that balance.
It's very, very interesting to me in many different ways, but want to focus on in this question. Plaid has been such a success story. You know, Zach, who you just mentioned, one of the founders, what an experience that guy had at a pretty early age in his entrepreneurial journey. And, you know, obviously what's underneath the iceberg was unbelievable intelligence and hard work. And technically, you know, I followed a lot of the journey very early on. Like, it was a real kind of set it up in the garage situation where they saw the market early. And then we were really fortunate to have Keith on the show maybe a couple of years ago from Plaid as well. At that point, clearly very successful and around a point of time where the valuation was huge, right? So at this point, Zach's already created something monumental. Now he's going into the realms of what can be, you know, a globally disruptive business right at the highest level. And he's getting to work with individuals like you, who obviously come from, you know, some of the biggest organizations in the world. The question is this: what have you seen in the culture that for this next phase needs to change?
You've given me something to think about, but I think as the business grows and matures, there's always this balance of how do you keep the agility and the speed and the scrappiness of the startup-like environment, but then enable fast decision-making in a larger organization. So what I've seen with organizations that have grown, as the number of people grows, by definition, complexity grows. And so you end up having to have more process with more people. But there's always the risk of the pendulum swinging too far, and I guess slowing it down too much. And I kind of think of Plaid as a bit of a teenager in that regard. You know, like when you're a teenager and you're running super fast, but it's all kind of like slightly uncoordinated. I mean, unless you're an athlete, but in any case, it's slightly uncoordinated, but you get there super fast. And I think of us as that teenager, like the values and the essence of the company that Zach and William and many others have created actually very much stays the same. But it's kind of, how do we start behaving in that bigger sense? And so where process does make sense and where process doesn't make sense, where are the places that you go faster, and where are the places where actually maybe slower now makes us faster later because we're now a global business. So getting that decision, it requires kind of continuously different mental models for when you make those decisions, and adjusting that continuously and expecting every leader to do that honestly and being aware of that. That is taking time. It's not a single answer to your question around culture, but I also think many of the listeners can probably relate to this. As we scale, kind of, we all go through this journey as a business.
Yes, and I think right now is triply interesting because there have been cultural shifts due to macro environments, COVID being one of them, workforces being distributed. So there's been a lot of flux going on in cultures. And there has also been, a historical bull run up until the end of last year. We're coming up into the end of 2022, but certainly up to the end of 2021, a lot of tech stocks had historically all-time high valuations. And so there's been, over the last several months, a big adjustment in the private market as well. And so, management philosophy has been changing. Cultures have been changing from what was really at the end of that very, very famous big tech, Google being probably the poster child of canteen lunches, bean bags, which, and many more things, and obviously an unbelievable platform. So the mission of why somebody may well have gone and worked there, being relatively different to what that might look like moving forward in this next couple of years, given we're in a bear market, and you're seeing a lot of companies trying to make their staff more optimum in preference to just, there's a war for talent, let's go and get everybody. And so that's very interesting for me in the innings that you've come into Plaid as well, which just looks like a poster child of a rocket ship. People who were the brightest people on the planet wanted to come there. I believe you guys are still in that unbelievable opportunity space. Some aren't, you guys still are. How has Zach and how have you thought about this, and has anything had to, from your observations coming in, these are hard questions to answer, but that makes them interesting, changing the culture from that teenager who got here, as you just really eloquently explained, still wanting to keep the agility, but what got us here might not be exactly what gets us to the next thing. So what do we need to refine into? But is there anything in the culture that dramatically does need to change as well, given everything I just kind of gave as a context?
I mean, I think like another context, which I think is really important, and this is something that's really attracted me to Plaid as well, is as I thought about various rocket ships, right? And there is ways to think about businesses. I really looked for a place that looked at building a generational business. And a generational business for me is one that endures good times and tough times. And what's been actually incredibly attractive to me even before I joined is I heard Zach articulate very clearly that this is incredibly important to him as well. Like the way he thinks about the business, et cetera, becomes like it's a holistic thing. It's the culture, it's the people, it's the lunches, but it's also, is the business a viable business in a very long term, and what does that make it, and how does that like the longer term strategy? And so from a cultural perspective, I actually think that we're incredibly well set up to take on that next chapter.
Yeah.
It's actually like a teenager that grew up with the right context and therefore is kind of heading for the win. So it gives me the confidence, and it's probably not the answer that you were looking for, but as I kind of listen to you and reflect on the last few months, that's kind of where I'm landing. And culturally, it's about kind of maintaining that hunger, but at the same time, the humility of going after this tremendous opportunity that is in front of us.
Yeah, thank you. And, strategically we'll come to...
And it's not a given. Sorry, I just interrupted you, but it's not a given that you get it. And I think that's where the hunger and the humility come into play together.
And we'll strategically get to, what your Zach and a few others' vision is and why this is a generational business. Before we do that, because we're starting in the real now, tactically, let's do a few things. So let's just assume for any of the audience who don't understand exactly what you're up to as a business, if you could just explain, elevator pitch, user case, and let's go through what's going on at Plaid with you right now. So the user case to start with, please.
Yeah. So imagine you're downloading an investments app. And in order to be able to connect that investment app to all of your finances that currently are most likely sitting with a bank, you need to connect those accounts. And not only do you need to connect that account, you also need to make sure that there is money in that account so that you can actually invest and be able to kind of benefit from the service that you have chosen already, right? Like, and that is very much that journey that every user of fintech goes through today, that is powered by Plaid and makes it effectively seamless for you as an end user. For you, Lloyd, if you've never downloaded an investments app, we just make it super easy for you. You don't have to submit any papers. You don't have to do anything. It's literally just a few clicks away. But it's also incredibly important for the investment app itself, or the business that is behind it, because that business itself, especially in today's world, is spending a lot of money on attracting users like you. And so for them, it's kind of, how do you maximize the ROI? How do you make sure that every user that you've gotten to download the app actually completes that journey and gets to that first magic moment of getting their investment in, if you see what I'm trying to get at? And so for them, that conversion is equally important. And kind of what makes Plaid very special in this specific use case, there's many, but in this specific use case, what makes Plaid very special is the interests are completely aligned. The interests for Plaid, for the customer, or for the end user are completely aligned. And that is the kind of space that you want to continue to innovate in and make it better for every user.
Thank you. So if we just took that into, I mean, you're using me as an example there.
I probably shouldn't have, because you have many, but anyway.
I appreciate it. That's my favorite type of example. If we kind of added perhaps an even a further layer to that. So you're saying investment. Well, what do you mean by investment specifically?
It could be an app where you could be, in a current environment, for instance, it's probably not so easy to be continuing to save for every user, given that the cost of living are going up. So do you have a little bit of money at the end of the month? Do you do it at the time you get your paycheck, whatever it may be, but you put in bits of money into an app that allows you access to investments that maybe wouldn't have been available to you, or would require kind of like a years of savings, etc., or talking to someone to do it.
Yeah. And the technology where Plaid is coming in there, let's just think of one of those apps as being, you know, a lot of fintechs have been on this show, a Revolut or a Monzo or a Starling, and they have an investment element to that application, where you might put, as you just said, you know, your 10, 100 or £1,000 into some type of investment. The technology that's enabling that in that instance
is open banking. Yeah, exactly. It's open banking technology that's enabling that.
Yeah.
And we've got customers like Shares, like Moneybox, that are using Plaid today to do exactly that.
Yeah.
And what Plaid does, and kind of takes away the complexity for every developer that is building this app, is connecting to all of the banks and making sure that all of that is done effectively as simply as can be. So for the investment app itself, they don't have to connect to every bank and then make this connection on your behalf, Lloyd, because actually Plaid has taken away all that complexity, abstract away.
So thank you. Yeah, I try and take it from like as if I had very little knowledge and then up to 7.5. I'm getting there now. So Shares has been on, we had Ben Shamala on the podcast, and very exciting recent partnership with Serena Williams, which is super cool. And they're really starting to promote the business, but good traction there. So I'm going on to Shares, and so that Shares don't have to have synced with the hundreds of banks, Plaid as an open banking solution is connecting with them. And then when you're talking about you guys are all on the same page, incentive perspective wise, that's putting me in as the consumer into a situation where it's efficient. It's not like, well, I bank with NatWest, so this won't work now. So I can use the Shares application and not really need to know about Plaid. And then Shares into a brilliant situation because they can very quickly provide that way more efficient solution for me in this instance. and you into a situation where, of course, you're providing that value. Okay, I love it. If we were to now break down the different categories of finance where you're providing the solution, we're talking about investment there. What other segments of finance does Plaid offer this solution for?
Well, I mean, this works for any crypto exchanges, obviously, any fintech, any digital finance provider, to be honest, that is trying to onboard you, Lloyd, as a customer. For every one of them, this is a perfect solution. And so the likes of Gemini, Kraken, like every one of these are using providers like us, in this case is us, to onboard users into their solution. And I know that we're kind of like at the 7.5 level, but what is incredibly exciting about open banking, I think personally, is not only that it allows many end users or consumers to actually kind of adopt digital financial services relatively easily, but it's also kind of the opportunities that it creates, right? Like there's also lots of other opportunities that come with open banking in the UK and PSD2 in Europe that kind of create that space for innovation, which I personally find incredibly exciting. Now I'm getting into the 9 out of 10. I realize
good.
So.
Well, you've leveled me up to somewhere around 7.5. A lot of our audience already sitting at 9. I'm always trying to talk somewhere between a CEO who manages a fintech and then my mum. These are the people I have in my mind. So now let's go to that type of level of topic. So what is that opportunity? Why is open banking providing something even further additionally valuable for Lloyd in this situation?
So I think accessing is one thing, but then another thing becomes what about money movement? So you've done it once, you've downloaded the app, but if you want to be doing this on a repeated basis, can you set it up in a way that is completely seamless for you and allows you to be able to kind of manage it once and then go back to it and always be in control, not only of your data, but also how you move money and to whom you move money on a regular basis. So that's kind of one piece of the equation that is incredibly exciting. And kind of in a variable recurring payments is probably one that like I'm referring to here. There's also a huge opportunity that is very much on the horizon with account-to-account payments. Obviously, like the usage of account-to-account payments is continuing to grow and adoption is continuing to grow. And as users become more adept at moving money via open banking rails, it also allows them to do that in other circumstances as well, which then opens up even more opportunities. So that's kind of like where my head is. And recently, we published this research about kind of like what is the impact of open banking. And we've mostly talked about consumers to date. So we've talked about Lloyd, but if we take Lloyd's business and look at a small business or a medium business and kind of the impact that it's having on those, it's I think today it's 1 in 2, which is the number of small businesses using open banking enabled services already, and continuing to grow. And it's like to me that is a huge potential.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we're just thinking about the landscape, I know that you're competitive. How could you not be with the career that you've had? It's not a given, as you said. There is agency that the team at Plaid need to take to carry on taking the opportunity. Talk us through the landscape, competitively.
I think open banking is definitely a competitive environment in Europe. There's a number of players that are all innovating. And the way I think about it, and this was actually the point of view I had before I even came into the industry, and I still hang on to it, is the opportunity is nascent enough that we need all of us collaborating together to actually create the environment in which this innovation and the opportunity for kind of value creation continues to happen. And perfect examples of that are us collaborating with our competitors around open finance, and kind of making sure that we work with policymakers and driving towards kind of broader adoption of open banking, leading more to open finance and opening up further, kind of creating that opportunity for innovation across more types of accounts, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's at that phase. I completely agree. And I kind of riffed on what you've just said there, where I see that collaboration. I suspect in 3 to 5 years that might start getting different. But right now,
I think we're early enough that there's just...
Yeah, absolutely. And like the vibe really that started in fintech and then, you know, in this segment, and also I believe in Web3 as well, is an awareness of, you know, if we can get this right, that such brilliant value comes from it. You do see nice community effects.
Yeah.
And, you know, I see a lot of the stuff that kind of Zach puts out narrative wise, and he's right on point there. It's clearly you are, so I love it. Okay, Ripsy, that gives the audience a really good vantage into, you know, what you and Plaid Europe and Plaid overall are up to right now. So let's move into the bio section and get to understand everything about you. If we could start with you setting the origin story and going back as far as possible to give us a view of, you know, very early on your environment, please.
Yeah, happy to. I think I generally kind of think of my life in 3 chapters, and I always joke that every ex-McKinsey consultant thinks of everything in 3s, but it really, for me, it really holds true. And so kind of that origin story is your typical and atypical immigrant story. I was born and raised in Armenia. Lots of things were changing around me. I saw political shifts that, you know, as a young child, I couldn't quite understand the mega impact that they were going to have on my life or those around me, but you kind of sense it in the air around you that this is big and major. And that's on one side. The second side is I always loved numbers and kind of like, yeah, that's the thing that kind of excited me as well. And the third piece, which is my mom was a single mom, and kind of she had decided early on that I should study English, which was, you know, in those days in Armenia was like way ahead of time. And so I got a job relatively early on in my teenage years working as an interpreter, which kind of set me up on this journey of saying, I know the world is changing around me. I know there's a lot more out there, and I cannot wait to experience it. So I guess like there is a lot in that origin story, and there's a lot of kind of moments of determination and perseverance and grit that kind of comes growing up in that environment. But the beginning of the next chapter is kind of that flight that I took from Armenia on the way to the US.
Let's stay in the origin section just briefly. So of those 3 different elements, why do you think your mother was ahead of her time in thinking about the importance of language? What do you think led to that?
I think there was a couple of things. One is, I don't think I've actually ever shared this publicly, but so she obviously grew up in the former Soviet Union, but she was a huge jazz fan. So we always kind of had the music culture around us, and there was always this influence of English around us already. So that was one side, and I think she always kind of had that eye out. There's a second piece to her, and this is like, I think she looked around and she said, how do I maximize opportunities for my kid? And this was a bet and a gamble that she took, because it took a lot of kind of personal time and commitment for her to be able to give this opportunity to me. And was
she teaching you then?
No. She didn't speak a word of English. So she had to get a private teacher to teach me effectively. But that she had to ferry me there, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's kind of where the commitment was. And so there was this kind of cultural aspect. My grandfather had spent time in Soviet concentration camps. So there was a lot of, like, our family had always had an eye out, but it never was the driving force. And I think for my mom, it was more, how do I create options? How do I create options for this kid that then she can do and make choices that kind of create a path for her? And yeah, would have guessed.
Unbelievable. Whilst that was going on at school, so this is different for everybody, but like, let's say, you know, one of the elements there is that you became engaged with numbers. You're also learning English as a language. So somewhere around probably, I don't know, but 11, 13, whatever that age for you was, you know, it's starting to find out. I mean, for me personally, okay, I'm pretty bad at this thing. Maybe I'll work on this thing because I want to be good at it, but I'm bad at it. Again, quite naturally good at this. You know, you're probably quite good with numbers. You've got language, but like, who were you in school at that point? Were you introvert? You know, were you playing jazz? Like, give us a little bit more color around that as well, please.
I think I was an introvert that wanted to be an extrovert. I danced, I was athletic, but I also had this sense of, in some ways, I also grew up in a Russian-speaking family, and Armenia was going through a cultural change at the time as well. And so there was always this sense of a little bit of, I don't know that I fully fit in. So there were that was kind of like one of the pieces of the teenage years. And I remember actually at some point being like, but I don't want to study English anymore. Like, I don't see why. Good that I did, obviously, but I think there was a moment of like, why am I doing these things, and how do I find kind of like who I am really?
How did you, at that point where you thought you might step away from there being value in English, stay on track?
I think probably the belief in the optionality that it created for me. Like, I don't know that. And this is
personally, you thought that through, or was this where your mother would
I'm sure there's an element of a parent that comes in there, right? Like, there's got to be that. But there was in me, like there was a period of time when life got so difficult that I was committed to making the most of what I had.
Yeah.
And it isn't, I couldn't have articulated this to you. There was no way I could have said it in Armenian, Russian, or English. It doesn't matter what language. But there was an element of, there's got to be more to what I can do, that fundamental deep belief of there's more. The world is out there and there is more. And I think it's that's where it clicked for me, where it just became this thing where I went all in on this commitment to, like, I wanted to study abroad.
Yeah.
This thing happened at that particular point in time. And then
I'm you know, so fortunate to speak to so many people who, you know, leading in industry, and that moment happens very different times for everybody's journey, but typically it happens. And then from there, you've got that power to really, you know, whatever your natural abilities are, take it to 10, because any successful journey is going to take an awful lot of a bunch of things. One of them will be resilience, you know, having this huge big picture that's so much of a dream that you'll carry on. And so you find yourself at this point, having gone through that moment, compelled to go abroad, and then this is a massive moment in your journey. So could you talk to us about that as well, please?
Yeah. I mean, I think kind of like I always think about what is the moment that kind of probably like there are multiple S curves in our life, and this is probably like one of those inflection points. And it's that flight. I took a flight from Moscow on the way to the US to study. I had a scholarship at Brigham Young University. I couldn't be more excited to be on my way. But there are still moments when I remember, like I deeply remember, like physically remember what it felt like when you go through passport control. And like I could see my mom and dad on the other side, and I waved at them. And like my dad had flown in especially as well to like make sure that he could even say goodbye. And I kind of like I just gone through. I remember what that felt like. It felt like the world was my oyster, but at the same time, like excuse me, like oh shit. But there is no like at that point you don't like you've gone. And you know there have been other moments like that, but that is probably one where I'm really glad I was 17 and not older, because if I were older, I'd probably think of all the risks associated with it, et cetera, et cetera. But at that point, you're like, the world is my oyster. I'm just going for it. And then I was all in, like you've committed and you're on board, as they say.
Amazing. It's necessary when you're creating to shed a skin, and you know, imagine that moment for you as that. And then you know, are in this amazing institute. What were you studying at that point?
I was studying, so I arrived studying molecular biology. I come from a kind of, my mom was a doctor, my grandmother was a doctor, so I believed I should be a doctor as well. And so I started studying molecular biology, but by chance, because it's the US and you do liberal education as well. I took an economics course my first semester. And I was like, "Oh, I like this thing," and so I just kept taking courses along the way.
What do you remember liking particularly about it?
I think it just clicked. Like I remember thinking about like for the first time seeing like demand curves, et cetera, and just being like, "This makes sense." Like it just clicked in my brain.
Yeah.
But it also spoke to the quantitative part of me. And I was like, suddenly these things start making sense and they fall into place.
So where does that take you next? You start, you know, after really leaning into it and feeling a connection, and I'm sure, you know, reading various books and publications, you start thinking about your career being focused within finance, economics.
Yeah, exactly. So I effectively kind of during my time at university, I refocused my career. I still graduated with molecular biology and econometrics, which is kind of where the numbers and the math started coming in.
That's very hot right now. You know, econometrics, biology, the kind of machine learning and AI around that right now is one of the three massive sectors.
It is. It's huge. I was like way ahead of my time, as they say. There was no such thing as computational biology at the time. But in any case, and so then I did my master's in statistics, and effectively kind of pulled all of these pieces came together. And you know, as many things are, like there's lots of small decisions that end up being big, but you just don't know they are. And I probably with the same belief and the same kind of like chutzpah ended up applying for a job at investment banks coming out with my master's, and landed a gig at Goldman. Had no idea what I was getting myself into, to be completely honest. Like, I didn't even own a suit. It just was so far outside of my league at the time. But in a lot of ways, you know, it happened to be a place that valued people with kind of the grit, the perseverance, the willingness to work hard, but also like we're open just with the ability to learn. And kind of that chapter of my life is the chapter that I call Sponge. And the reason I call it the Sponge is because I took opportunities because they were learning opportunities. I was curious, I was excited. The world continued to be my oyster. And in, you know, it's a good combination of hard work, luck, people you meet that
in the sponge phase, which I'm completely stealing off you. That's amazing. We give a lot of recommendations, you know, when people are looking where to go in their careers, and I mean it's very different for everybody, right? But certainly to say, you know, go and embrace a sponge phase is a great thing. So
it's a good line.
I'm going to steal that. You were at Goldman's, McKinsey. Specifically, what was, and you know, kind of short, snappy questions here if possible. What was great and bad about Goldman's and great and bad about McKinsey?
Great, super smart people, lots of opportunity. Bad, I didn't see myself there.
Why?
It didn't click.
What about it?
I looked around. I actually remember this. I remember looking around one day and being like, I don't want to be any one of the people that sit in the offices. I was on a trading floor. And that's when I was like, then why should I work this hard if I don't want to be them?
What was it looking at who they were and represented in their ethics and values, and versus what yours were, or what was it? Why didn't you want to be their peer group or aspire to be them?
I've thought about this so much. I was lucky to have worked with lots of great people as well. I could see that I didn't want it, but I didn't know what I wanted instead, if you see what I mean, which actually dictated why I ended up going to business school in a lot of ways. I obviously did not write this on my essay, but I felt like I needed the space to think what I wanted to be.
Yeah.
And then at McKinsey, what was great, again, lots of learning, lots of really smart people that I aligned with culturally. And what I didn't like was that I didn't get to make the decisions. Like, I advised people, I helped people, but I wasn't accountable in the end. And I missed that accountability. And I have to say, like, I mean, in so many ways, consider myself so lucky that today, like, I have a job where I actually really, truly love what I do. Like, I have the accountability piece. I get to solve amazing problems with amazing people at a time where the world around us is changing. So it's kind of like, it took following my gut and intuition and what I was seeing around me to be able to land on the thing that honestly I didn't know existed when I came out of school.
Yeah.
And so
it's hard to clarify in the moment, and actually often in reflection, but you know, that instinct that you're talking about, so important, but the key being you've put yourself into a position, absorb what you can. You know, these are premium environments. There are bright people. There's processes to learn, but also make sure that, you know, the journey is trying to take you to where then, you know, the whole kind of package comes together. In terms of the move where you go to Apple, you know, at that point, this is moving from finance to consulting to what is now the most valuable company on the planet, but at that point is really, you know, one of the 5 big tech players. What was that experience for you? Was that a moment where you thought, okay, this feels right, or was it not until you get to booking.com where it's slightly more early and entrepreneurial? Which one, and how was Apple?
I think that move felt really right, because I left consulting to go into a P&L role with a brand that I respected hugely at a time where I felt like it was a huge potential. And like, it was like, I mean, at that time, everyone could see that there was potential, but it wasn't a given yet, right? Like, the App Store was just starting. Like, there were lots of early things still. So that felt right. And then Booking felt right after. Meaning, because when I joined Booking with, you know, no team, built a product from scratch, see where it takes you in this completely entrepreneurial role. And so I had the experience at Apple to help me kickstart that. But there is a beauty that comes with building something from scratch. And I have never forgotten what it feels like to track something on a whiteboard.
Yeah.
Like, that moment is amazing.
Yeah. And, probably one of the most glorified and potentially rightly so leaders of ever is Stephen Jobs. And one of the things that for me is interesting here is very famously how he kind of ripped the Macintosh team separate to the overall organization, where he was really at the point of innovating and the organization needed him to do that. That's in phase one, and was able to get the Macintosh team to be incredibly productive, but the organization not so. And then in phase two, where he comes back, it felt like he managed to get the whole organization into sync. He'd learned various leadership skills, maybe the technology was at the right time and a bunch of other stuff. So you're at Apple in a really interesting point, as you just say, where it wasn't the rock and roll success that we take for granted. I mean, it always blows my mind to think just how recently even the iPhone came out. You just think like that's been around almost my whole life. And it hasn't, it's the success was just wild over a 10-year period. So just because it's so interesting to me. So what phase exactly are you in at Apple? And actually what I would like you to talk to, which is very connected to what we're talking about with Plaid in this era where it's been a success, it's a rocket ship, but you guys want to have like a thread across the whole business of culture where it's still agile, but it's the next phase. Talk to us about that phase with Apple where Steve is at the helm.
Yeah. So I joined after iPhone, just immediately after iPad. So they exist, but they're babies.
Wow.
They're still early. And I'm spending most of my time working in emerging markets. I mean, the thread in all of these things is that I do end up building stuff inside businesses. But so the phase from a business perspective, I think Apple hadn't fully cracked yet the platform. This piece that there are businesses and there's things that are going to be built on top that will continue to create value for those businesses as well as for the underlying platform, aka the App Store and many others. Like we'd had the iTunes and there were elements of it already. And obviously Steve, an amazing visionary who had all of these pieces in his head. But it hadn't kind of fully materialized to the extent that it was about to materialize. And there were a few things at the time when I remember at Apple, we were talking about, for instance, Apple competitors in the US versus in emerging markets. We were, from a hardware perspective at the time, we were competing with Samsung quite heavily. And it wasn't clear how it was going to go in emerging markets and why. And kind of building out the holistic proposition in market and understanding the local differences and what matters to consumers, et cetera, became incredibly important. I mean, I ended up having to work on convincing people to also build apps. Like, it's crazy today. Like, when you tell people you had to convince someone to build an app, is just unheard of. But that's the beginning of the platform, right? Like, you need to have both the supply and the demand side working together. And the vision that Steve had was that we would be able to jumpstart that in every market. And I think that's that time. And there were things that were working and there were things that weren't working. But like, as a whole, there was such a passion for what we were doing. There was just, and not a question that we would win. It was just more a matter of how.
Amazing insights. And I feel like that is why you're so ideal for the role that you've got, because Plaid, it feels like it's a similar-ish type of time, and for open banking it's a similar type of time where when we look back it'll probably just be, well, obviously, right, of course, but actually certainly it doesn't feel like that at the moment. You have to have the agency to push it through, but you've learned what culture and belief can make that happen. So It's really exciting. We're going to go on to the searching for Mana quickfire round now, okay. Ripsy. Just before we do that, because I don't actually have this question covered, how has so that's kind of the journey in work. How has life been in parallel to that? Just so that we've got some type of
exactly.
context, I mean, as well. You know, you dancing, you're playing jazz. What's going on?
No, I'm not dancing. I'm not playing jazz. I mean, it's like the third chapter, you know, like the professional third chapter is platforms, but the parallel chapter is me becoming a parent. We've got a 7 and a 5-year-old who keep me on my toes more than any platform challenge has ever kept me on my toes.
You got a fresh whiteboard scenario again there.
Yeah, exactly. And I continue to learn, but it's like, for me, this has been an incredibly grounding period as a human as well, because you learn so much about yourself, the goods, the bads, the uglies, the wonderfuls, and that in a lot of ways is also what makes me today. And I can no longer separate those parts. And I've come to the conclusion that there's not like a professional and a personal and this other part. It's all one. I'm the human that I am today, and because of all of these experiences that I've had, and that's what makes me a better leader. But that's very much a big chapter of who I am. And that's probably part of the reason why I don't dance and jazz and all of the other things.
Just one parenting question.
Yeah.
I'm a 4-year-old daughter, so you just think these things through, don't you? But not about me. Your background, the story that made you is almost impossible to replicate with your children. It sounds like you had the world's most incredible mother, but there were challenging scenarios, and you kind of had that flight moment where, as a young person, you went off to a different country and had so much grit and motivation from that journey you had. It's probably not going to happen with your children, I assume. How are you thinking through, already have kind of struck the balance of, they've got a very different environment, but those traits have been so useful for you to be successful in your career?
So my husband and I talk about this lots. So he comes from a very different background. He grew up in northern Italy, in Torino, kind of typical European middle-class family. And we talk a lot about, like, what makes it tick is just the values that are ingrained in us, like deeply, what are the things that we really care about? And where we have landed, and you know, the thing with kids is you can't run an A/B experiment, so it's going to be what it's going to be. What we've committed to is kind of like, what are the sets of values that we feel so deeply around that we want to instill in our children? And they are very much about kind of, how do we treat our humans? How do we think about work? That we focus on solving problems. Like, there are things, and it was actually been incredibly gratifying is seeing my kids use those, like start to use them sometimes in different settings. And so while I worried about that a lot, that's question that you asked, where I'm landing to now is, if the values are in place, and if as a family you're consistent in the application of those values, you don't have to recreate the really difficult contextual environment. And the perseverance, the grit, the willingness to have impact, they will come from other sources. And maybe they won't be to the same degree, but they will come in a beautiful combination of its own.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good to hear. And really, really super on point with, how I think about culture in different environments. We've, been very fortunate on the show to have people from absolutely every walk of life, and there's no one path that can make you have, forget how successful it is, a fulfilling career. where there's creativity and there's connection with the mission and the purpose. I think that's probably the same with family as well, isn't it? If there's relatively, clear ethics and values that run through. Yeah. Amazing. So let's go through the mono round. So relatively quick fire questions, but Ripsy, feel to go into as much detail as you care on any of them. In terms of message that you would put onto the front cover of whatever publication is really dear to you, something like The Economist, perhaps, Forbes. I don't know what your favorite publication is. You go on.
Well, I mean, I read lots of The Economist. We can say The Economist, but yeah.
What would you put on the front cover of The Economist?
I think the power of choice. And the reason for that is I've grown up in an environment, like early on in my childhood, there was less choice. And I've seen the limiting effect that can have. I see that the power of choice can unleash creativity, and areas like combining economics and molecular biology would have never happened had I gone to university back in Armenia, where you study one subject. That's how it is. But it's also, I've seen it confirmed. Like, I've had the pleasure of working in e-commerce and running experiments and seeing what the power of choice does to consumers. And I see how it gives confidence to my kids when I give them choices, and they learn how to make those choices and they understand the implications. So, and I'm like, and then there are also political applications of this, etc. But I don't want to go there. It's like, so for me, the power of choice is,
yeah, I love it.
It's tremendous.
That's amazing. What is currently keeping you up at night?
Not much. I'm actually like, but not because I don't think about things. I think we are at a very special time in our generation. And I think about that a lot. I think a lot about the political situation around us, the cost of living crisis, like what does this do in the long term? I think about the opportunities that creates for our businesses. So there's a lot of that. But the reason it doesn't keep me awake at night is I deeply care about that context. And then I go quickly to what are the things that are within our control, and what is it that we as individuals, as a business, as a community, as a community can do.
Thank you. Love to know what type of rituals in the morning perhaps you have, anything that gives you the right mindset, gets you kind of energized, or whatever it might be for you, please.
Yeah, I as a working parent and as a working mom, probably had to learn the hard way how important it is to take care of yourself. And so I kind of would get up in the morning, and there's kids and there's breakfast, get them to school, etc. It's at work, blah, 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 blah. And then the workout and all of these other things would be in the evening, and you're just too tired. And so I got into this habit actually during COVID, is where I would get up before the kids, and I'd work out, and then I'd start making their lunch boxes. And that I value that time tremendously. So I get up, I work out. It's a different type of workout than I would do normally, or I go for a run if I can. But that is a very special time. And it also gives me the sense of taking care of me before the rest. And it really, it's done lots of good.
Do you have any particular type of mantra or saying that's really important to you that you come back to?
Everything.
A motto or an affirmation, etc.
No, I don't really use affirmations, to be honest. I mean, I do often say to the kids and to myself, everything is possible and we solve problems. these are things that just I find myself repeating over and over.
Yeah, really strong. Anything that goes in and hits the old chimp is then getting diffracted back in essence with a growth mindset. I love it. Is there a book, and again, if it's short form, long form, podcast, whatever it might be, that you'd like to recommend to the audience, and feel free to choose one or two.
One of the things that I've done, again, this is like the post-COVID, is I've started reading paper books again. I had gone back to reading Kindle, and then I've gone back to reading paper books, and I do about 15 minutes before I go to bed of nonfiction. And so one of the ones that I've read this year that I've absolutely loved was the Magic Circle. No, The Great Circle. Sorry, The Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. And it's about a woman at the turn of the 20th century who sees a pilot and realizes that her dream is to be a pilot, and then she becomes a pilot, and then she tries to fly around the globe. Is an amazing, like, the prose is amazing, the story is entertaining. It's great. It's wonderful.
It's great reading paperback. For me, I've come back to it recently, and it just makes me go to sleep. That you're not looking at a screen. I know the Kindle's got a better screen than an iPhone, let's say, but I just find how exhausted I am. So if I'm not, I might read for however long it might be, but more often than not, within 5 to 10 minutes,
you're out. Exactly.
Oh my God, I need to go to sleep. And choosing something that's not a business book or got too much type of learning behind it, I really started to enjoy myself as well. Great. Well, we'll put that in the show notes. That sounds fantastic. And to finish the round off on the Searching for Mana show. So Mana is your magic, your superpower. What, Ripsy, is your Mana?
Oh gosh, I should have been prepared for this one. Connecting dots. And I say that because it goes beyond listening. It requires a huge amount of empathy, and you have to understand it to be able to connect it. And I love it when I'm in the flow and I get to do that. Like that just gives me lots of joy.
And it makes complete sense in terms of your career and what you're doing. I love it. Who would be your recommendation for a dream guest to come on the Searching for Mana show?
Ooh, a dream guest. There's so many. Oh gosh. You get Tim Cook.
That would be amazing. Yes. if you can hook us up, then we'll let him on.
Obviously there's so much innovation that is happening at Apple, and there were so many questions about him taking over from an iconic figure like Steve. I think there are some really amazing conversations to be had.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to try and find his Mana as well, because unbelievable challenge that he's taken on, and pretty much every way been monumentally successful. But from that kind of relatively conservative external persona, it'd be nice to get under the skin and all the fire that he brings, because I know he does, obviously. That would be amazing. Okay, so just lastly, wanted to, because we've spent a lot of your precious time, let you finish really and riff on what the Hollywood version for Zach and you and Plaid would be.
Yeah, I think The Hollywood version for me is really truly comes down to the mission, which is what originally attracted me to Plaid. And it is unlocking financial freedom for everyone. And when we've achieved that mission, which is that every person has access to every financial service that they want and that they need to run their lives efficiently, and when that complexity goes away from them, that I think is that's when we know you're there. Do you see what I mean? That is like when the music starts coming in.
Well, we should outro this. Ollie, who'll produce it, put some jazz on at that moment. And exactly. Then I love it because that's bringing together what you would put on the front of The Economist, which is having, you know, available options and the positive outcomes that come from that. And then also your superpower, your mana, which is connecting the dots. So I love it. I can understand why that mission is just so amazingly exciting for you, Ripsy. Thank you so much for coming on the Searching for Mana show. Super kind of journey that you've taken, and congratulations on all your success today. I know you're not going to stop here, so we will watch with great attention the next phase.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.